Welcome to Books and Bridges for another deep dive into the best of human thought. We are a public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. In our busy society, we need space for a little more heart-to-heart and mind-to-mind. With so much discord among us, the wisdoms of the world lift us to our better angels. There is far too much awe and wonder in life to bother with resentment and outrage. Tonight, we explore the great Persian poet Rumi. Our age of science, technology, efficiency, and abundance somehow leaves us empty. We seek something bigger beyond the visible. Rumi takes us out of our comfortable cages and shows us the air outside. He has that rare ability to elevate the mind, deepen the heart, broaden the sympathies, inspire the spirit, and enliven the imagination. And all this from across the centuries. What does it mean for a book or a poem or a song to last? What stays in place as the sands pile up, as cities rise and fall, as nations perish and come into existence? Can a person who lived 750 years ago in a land far away speak to my concerns today? Are we forever resigned to be alone in our own time, isolated in our own locale? To ask such questions is to enter the spiritual terrain of Rumi. Our guest tonight is Rasoul Shams, PhD, professor of geoscience at the University of Utah, author, translator, broadly learned in Persian literature. He is a passionate promoter of Rumi. He has led the Rumi Poetry Club for 16 years and has written a number of books on that great perennial poet. His life spans both East and West, as he has lived and studied in Iran, India, Japan, and the United States. So thank you for joining us, Rasoul. Thank you for being here. What we will do, we'll listen to you, to your remarks, and then afterwards I'll open up the floor for discussion, and we can engage you with some questions.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this gathering, this session of Books and Bridges. One of the miracles of literature is that it connects people, and you meet really wonderful souls. And for me personally, it has been a pleasure and privilege to know Nathan Nelson. He has been leading this group, Books and Bridges, since 2017. And I remember the first meeting, the first session of Books and Bridges was in April 2017, if I remember well. And he kindly invited me to give a presentation on Rumi, although in those days we had in-person gatherings. So it was an honor for me to do that. And today it is an honor again to share with you some of my thoughts about Rumi. I am going to share my screen because I have a few slides to show, and also there are some poems and quotes which I cannot remember all of them. So with your permission, I am going to share. Okay, let me go to Zoom. Okay, Nathan, my screen is visible?
Yes, it looks great.
Thank you. Well, this year, 2023 is the 750th anniversary of Rumi's passing. So he died in 1273, 750 years ago. And I thought it's good to stand back and try to understand why we need classical poetry today. I mean, in the past 7 decades, so much has changed in the world, let alone 7 centuries or so. So the title of this, I wouldn't say even presentation, but talk, is Reading Rumi in the 21st Century, How Classical Poetry Can Help Us Today. Since this is a session of books and bridges, so I will start off with introducing this book, Why Poetry Matters. This was published several years ago by Jay Parney, and I read it at that time. He's trying to explain why poetry is so important. But the way he starts his book, I will read the first 2 lines from his book. These are the opening lines. Poetry doesn't matter to most people. That is, most people don't write it, don't read it, and don't have any idea why anybody would spend valuable time doing such a thing. This is so true. Poetry is the least read genre in literature today. Most poetry books don't sell well, unless, of course, it is Rumi's poetry or a poet of that caliber. Most people in our society prefer to spend hours in front of TVs, play computer games, filling their time with entertainment. And of course, there is nothing wrong with any of those. But the fact is that sometimes those entertaining hours are actually a way for us to escape from anxiety, escape from stresses. But the question is entertainment really a solution to most of the problems that we in our own lives or our society faces? As I said, entertainment, everything has its own place in our life, but the fact is that poetry does not have its deserved place in our life, in our society, in our literature. When I was a college student, long time back in the last century, I happened to read, well, I took English literature, of course, but I happened to read this book, An Introduction to the Study of Literature. This was published in the early decades of 20th century. So it was an older book, even then. But what I liked about this book was that the author, William Hudson, had a very good chapter on poetry. What is a poem? And he had collected various definitions of a poem. For example, Samuel Johnson, he defines a poem as a metrical composition. John Stuart Mill, thought and words in which emotion spontaneously embodies itself. William Wordsworth, who was a very eminent poet, British poet, he says, poetry is the breath and the finer spirit of all knowledge. Matthew Arnold, again a 19th century English poet, he says, poetry is simply the most delightful and perfect form of utterance that human words can reach. Edgar Allan Poe, American poet of the 19th century, he says poetry is the rhythmic creation of beauty. And John Ruskin, an art critic, again, British art critic. He says, poetry is the suggestion by the imagination of noble grounds for the noble emotions. Now, all these authors and critics and poets, they are masters of their own craft. So their definitions should matter. We should pay attention to what they are saying, because if we don't, we will miss a very important asset in our life, poetry. Now, my own impression of poetry from Rumi's works, these are the elements that I have found in Rumi's own poetry. The first thing is the sound, the musicality of words. Even in free verse, we need to have some music of words in the poem, because that is a characteristic of poetry in the past and even today. The other element, which is very, very important in Rumi's poetry, is the imagery. It's like he's a painter. He's painting using words. That's also very important. And the third aspect is for the poet to take us, to use the words, to take us to a world of meanings. This is also very important. How can we use words, listen to words or read them, but then we go beyond the words, where it is wordless? This is a very important function of poetry. You see, in Zen tradition, they say that form and emptiness, they are mingled. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. In a way, poetry as a literary form, full of sounds, music, imagery, and painting, should take us to the spirit, to emptiness. So in that sense, actually poetry is a cure to most of our stresses, most of our anxiety, and a basic, fundamental solution, I would say. Again, using Rumi's own words, he says that imagine that's the winter time. There's lots of flu going around, lots of people have got cold, and you want to cure this problem. You want to cure all these diseases and solve this problem. Well, one way would be try to cure everyone. That is one approach. But another approach is to turn winter into a spring. That is a fundamental solution. In our own lives also, sometimes we want to escape because we are overwhelmed. But what would be a more reasonable approach to solve our problems, our stresses? If we are unwise, if we are not awakened, if we are very ambitious, greedy, egoistic, then we want to try to fight on all frontiers and then solve all the problems. And there's no end to it. But the other approach is to have a basic solution. That is awareness. That is going back to the world of meanings. That is going back to emptiness or our true spirit. So poetry has a very important role in doing just that, using words to take us to a world of spiritual meanings and values. Now, going back to this book, Why Poetry Matters by Jay Parney, he also mentions that every poet has his or her own voice. Very important. And in Rumi, from the experience that I have had with Rumi for over decades of reading and reflecting on his words and teachings, what he has done, he has integrated in his own life, in his own person, three important qualities, which is almost very difficult even to materialize any one of them in a single life. But somehow he managed to integrate these three things. One is his philosophical insight. He has tapped into the spiritual teachings of all ages. So his philosophical insight is very important. And of course, as a poet, he is very skillful in imagery, in literary skills, in words, music. And finally, his own life. As a person who lived his own poetry. So poetry was not detached from his life. He was not a professional poet that he would make a living by composing poems and publishing, etc. This is also very important. So he was at the same time a Shakespeare in terms of his literary skills, a Plato in terms of his philosophical insight, and also a sage, in terms of his spiritual living. And I think that is why his voice is so powerful, that can go across lands, across centuries, across cultures. And today, here, in the US in the 21st century, we can still read Rumi. Now, I will share a few quotes from Rumi himself, which would explain again why poem, words, literature is so significant, and we should not be deprived of this literature in our life. He has a book, Fihe Ma Fihe, which has been translated into English as Discourses of Rumi. There he says, speech is like the sun. All humans gain warmth and life from the sun. However, because the sun is not always visible, people forget that their warmth and life come from the sun. Although the celestial sun continuously shines, it does not come to our sight until its rays strike and illuminate a wall, a material object. In the same way, the sunlight of speech cannot be seen without the medium of words and sounds. This is how he sees a role for poetry, like a wall to reflect, to illuminate the sun of the spirit. This comes from one of his quatrains. He says, I am the wind, you are the leaf. How can you not dance? Very beautiful imagery. And this is, I guess, how he sees his role as a poet, to be the wind and to go among the leaves of the world. This is also a beautiful quote. I really like this. There is so much modesty and as well as wisdom in it. He writes, the poet digs a creek in the ground in order to send water to the following ages. Although every age has its own poets and messengers, the words of the bygone teachers are also helpful. He doesn't say you should always only read my poetry. He says every age has its own poets, its own thinkers, but it is also important to listen to the words of bygone teachers. And what does a poet do? He or she digs a creek in the sands of time, in the ground, to send this water, this spiritual water in the form of words and music to the future generations. This last quote from Rumi, he says, I am a mirror. I am not a man of speeches. Nonetheless, you can see my mind if your ears become eyes. This is also how he expects us to, how we should listen to or read a poem or listen to a poet. It says, your ears should become eyes. Then you can see yourself in the mirror of my poetry. It says, I am not a man of speeches. I'm not a politician. I'm not trying to sell words. No, I'm a mirror. But if your ears become eyes, then you can see yourself in the mirror of my poetry. Again, beautiful line. Now, a little bit about Rumi, his life, where he lived. This is a map of Asia, West Asia, Central Asia, Middle East in the 13th century. So you have Arabia here, Persia, Anatolia, today's Turkey. He was born in the city of Balkh. Today, Balkh is situated in Afghanistan, and it has lost its glory, especially with the the situation that the entire Afghanistan is in. But Balkh was one of the most ancient cities in Central Asia. Lots of religions, Zoroastrian religion, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, shamanism, you name it, all kinds of religions prevailed in Balkh in some time. So he was born there in 1207. This is the first decade of the 13th century. His father was a scholar. Somehow his father sensed that the Mongols are going to invade Persia and Balkh, which they did eventually. So he took his family and his disciples, hundreds of families, and they migrated westward. So through Persia, today's Iraq, and eventually they settled in the city of Konya in today's Turkey. And that is where Rumi lived most of his life. So when this thing happened, Rumi was about 12 or 13 years old. And then he died in Konya when he was 66, 67 years old. So if you go to Konya in Turkey today, you can see his tomb, his shrine, which is a museum now. I have been there several times. This is a picture that I took in 2010 or so. It's a very peaceful place. There's a huge garden. And in this tomb, his tomb, and also his families, his father's and his wife's, his children's tombs are there. This place was actually donated by the Sultan in the 13th century to Rumi's father. And I think it was a school at some point. And after Rumi's father died, he was buried there, and then they turned it into a garden. And so that's the history of this place. A very interesting thing, there are many interesting things about this place. You should really go and see. There is this poem. This is not Rumi's own poem, although most people quote this as Rumi's poem. This poem was there even before Rumi, but this is one of the poems that you would read on the wall of Rumi's shrine. Come, whoever you are, come again. Even if you are godless and the worshiper of fire and idols, come. Our home is the home of never losing hope. Come, even if you break your repentance vows 100 times, come again, come. A beautiful poem. And this really captures, his message and his approach to society and to people as a whole. Now, in that particular shrine or museum, they really maintain the garden really well. There you will see lots of roses. Rose was one of the most favorite things, in Rumi's life. He has lots of poems about rose. He also loved cats. So you will see lots of cats, roaming around freely. They are well fed. It's a beautiful, very peaceful place to be. In fact, there is a story about Rumi's cat. He had one cat who would follow him everywhere he went, to school, shopping, you name it. And it is recorded that when he died, this cat stopped eating. And eventually, after a few days, even the cat died. And Rumi's daughter wrapped this cat and buried the cat along with Rumi's body. So in his tomb, even his, pet, his favorite cat, is also buried. Now, what we say Rumi is not really his name. Rum in Persian, in Turkish, in Arabic means Anatolia, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Rome, basically, because he lived in Anatolia, which was really Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. So he is known as Rumi. But his name is Jalaluddin, means the glory of faith. Muhammad was his first name, which is a common name in the Middle East, and then Rumi. Because he was born in Balkh, people in Iran or in Afghanistan, they rarely call him Rumi, they call him Balkhi, because that is where he was born. But most popularly, he is known as Mavlana or Maulana or Mevlana, which means our master. This is a title that disciples and students give to their teachers. But in the case of the Rumi, Mavlana or Maulana, Mevlana has become his name. So for centuries, people simply call him our master in the East. Of course, we do not have a portrait of Rumi. This is the oldest portrait of Rumi which we have. This was done in the 16th century or so. Again, this is an artist's imagination. What we know of Rumi's, in terms of his physical complexion, etc., that he was tall, he was slim, and he looked very young. Even there is a story that, in the old days, people didn't have people would go to public baths. So there's a story that when Rumi and his son, who was 20 years younger to him, they both went to the public bath. People thought that they were brothers. So he looked very young. He didn't eat much. Even in his last will, he says that, don't eat much. It's not good. I mean, eating has its own, necessity, but just eating for the sake of eating. So he didn't eat much. He was very tall, slim. So I would think this is the closest, that we can imagine, closest to the reality of how he looked like. There are some other portraits. I have picked these two. These were done in the 1950s and 60s, and you may see them in books, book covers, etc. These two miniature paintings were done by two very famous miniature masters, painting masters in Iran, 1950s and 60s. There are lots of other portraits, but they're all imaginary. But I would think that this one is the closest that we can think of how Rumi looked like. Now, in 1244, when Rumi was 37 years old, he met an old man, a wandering dervish by the name of Shams. Shams means sun in Arabic, Persian, in Turkish, etc. And even in Hebrew, Shemesh means sun. It's the same root. Root word is the same. So Rumi was a scholar. He was a mystic. He was a scholar, but he was not a poet. He was never trained to be a poet. But in 1244, he met this wandering dervish, Shams, in Konya, and the conversation that they had, it really transformed Rumi. What do you see this painting? Again, this is a 16th century painting. It is still there in the museum, Topkapi Palace Museum. This is Rumi with his students. He used to dress like a scholar, huge turbans, very glorious, clothes and robes, etc. But after meeting Shams and this Shams and the conversation that they had, he was transformed. What went between these two, there are lots of stories, there are conversations, etc. But basically, Shams showed to Rumi that, all this knowledge, it's a huge weight. You need to live, spirituality. It's not simply books and, bookish knowledge, etc. So that was a turning point in Rumi's life. And I always, think that everyone needs a Shams, at some point, in life. It's really a privilege to have, an encounter with someone like Shams. Now, there have been lots of translations of Rumi into English. The first wave of translations started late 19th century to mid 20th century by mostly academic professors, professors of Persian literature at Cambridge, especially like Reynold Nicholson or John Arbery. Now, their translations were very literal, academic. Sometimes even they tried to translate into verse, rhyming verse in English. So today, for us, it may be a bit hard to read and understand these translations, but the second wave of Rumi translation began in the 1980s These were free verse translations or retranslations, and Coleman Barks really pioneered this genre. Um, he he's retired now, but he was a professor of poetry and creative writing at the University of Atlanta for decades. And in mid-70s, he discovered Rumi, and then he devoted the second half of his life basically to translating or retranslating Rumi. Of course, he doesn't know Persian. He uses the literal translations made by others, but he turns it into amazing poetry in English. But there are other translators. I just wanted to mention these two waves of translation, two different approaches to Rumi's poetry in English. Now, one thing which is important to remember is that even though today poetry doesn't play much role in our literature, in our lives, but in the past things were different. Now, speaking for the Persian language, culture, and literature, you see there are thousands and thousands of proverbs in Persian. Just, there are tens of thousands of proverbs in English. Now, in the case of Persian, most of these proverbs come from poems, classical poetry. And one scholar meticulously, collected and counted more than 1,200 Persian proverbs come directly from Rumi's works. This is amazing. And here I will read a few. I collected some of this in this book, The Words of Rumi. It was published several years ago. So I will read a few lines, proverbs in Persian contributed by Rumi. With children, speak in children's language. Through love, bitter things become sweet. Water beneath the boat is its life support. Water inside the boat is its death. Sunshine is the proof of the sun's existence. If you want more proof, keep gazing at the sun. Don't seek water, seek thirst. These are short lines, but full of wisdom. This quote from Rumi is also in that book which I mentioned, The Words of Rumi. This is not Rumi's poetry. This is attributed to him through oral tradition. But anyway, a beautiful poem. He says, in generosity and helping others, be like the river. In compassion and grace, be like the sun. In concealing others' faults, be like the night. In anger and rage, be as if you are dead. In modesty and humility, be like the sword. In patience and tolerance, be like the sea. In life, be yourself. Be as you appear to the side. Again, lots of wisdom and beautiful imagery. You can see that how he is connecting these qualities, noble qualities, to features, natural features like the sea, the soil, etc., etc. Now, some of Rumi's poems have become almost proverbs even in English, thanks to Coleman Barks' translation. For example, those who have read Rumi, I'm sure they are familiar with all these poems. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. The wound is the place where the light enters you. You are not just a drop in the ocean. You are the mighty ocean in the drop. What you seek is seeking you. These are very popular quotes from Rumi. And If you Google, you will find, I don't know, tens of thousands of websites which are using, quoting these lines from Rumi. Okay, I am going to, I don't know how much time we have, but I'd like to share one parable, one story from Rumi. This story is in the volume 6 of his Masnavi. Now, Rumi has two major works. One is what's called Divan Shams. Divan means book of poetry, and Shams was his mentor's name. So he named his book of poetry after Shams. So it's called Divan Shams, the book of poetry dedicated to Shams. Now that book has 3,500 lyric odes, 2,000 quatrains. So overall, you are dealing with 44,000 lines of poetry. Very lyric, very ecstatic, love poetry, etc. And as I said, he started composing poems when he was 37, and he died when he was 67. So the last 3 decades of his life, he composed lots of poems. But during the last 12 years of his life, he started composing a different type of poetry book, parables in verse. So he collected lots of stories from various traditions, India, ancient Greece, Jewish, Christian, Persian, you name it. And he turned them into parables, stories in his own words and in Persian verse. Now, this book, Masnavi, has 6 volumes. And the reason he had 6 volumes, he himself says that we are surrounded by 6 directions, north, south, east, west, up and down. So he wanted his book to illuminate all these directions. That is how he symbolizes it. In the last book, in the 6th volume of this book, he writes about the story of a man who lived in Baghdad, and he dreamed of a hidden treasure in Egypt. It's a beautiful story. I have recently written an essay about this dream of a hidden treasure, and it will be published this fall or so, September, October or so. I don't know how much time do we have. Nathan, we are okay on time? We are good?
Yeah, we have about 5-10 minutes or so.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have many slides, but let me just summarize this story. So the story goes like this, that there was a young man in Baghdad who inherited from his father a huge sum of wealth, money, land, and property. Being inexperienced with wealth, he began to spend it lavishly, as if there was no end to this wealth. Then Rumi adds, this is how we often treat what comes to us freely and easily. Consider your body and soul. It has come to you from God with no effort on your part. That is why we often do not appreciate how priceless our body or our soul is. After a while, the young man spent all his wealth and ended up in poverty and destitute. He realized his dire situation and started to cry and pray. Oh God, you once gave me wealth, but it vanished. Give me wealth again, or give me death. His prayers and laments were sincere. He had become empty. When the flute is empty, it makes wonderful music and draws the world to its tale and tune. When one is sincere and empty, the whole creation comes to his or her aid. One night, the man had a dream. A voice said to him, "Young man, your prayer is answered. Go to Egypt. That there is hefty treasure hidden in such and such place. Go to Egypt and you will receive wealth." In the morning, the man remembered his dream, although he did not know whose voice he heard in the dream or where it came from. The man left Baghdad for Egypt. The journey took many days, but the man was hopeful. On reaching Egypt, the man noticed that he had no more money. He was penniless and hungry. He had to earn some money and eat before he could search for the buried treasure. He thought of becoming a beggar, but his pride and honor held him back, for he was once a wealthy man in his own country. Meanwhile, the fear of starvation softened his ego. He decided to go for begging for food and money at night when people could not see his face and darkness would conceal his shame. As it happened, the very first night he slipped out for begging, the town was in a state of curfew. There had been lots of robberies in the area for many nights, and the caliph had ordered to arrest anyone who was out at night. The young man, unaware of the situation, was sitting in a street corner and waiting for people to pass. But there were no people on the street. Suddenly, the town's sheriff appeared and caught the young man by shoulder. "What are you doing here? Who are your other friends that help you with burglary? Tell me who you are. I have to take you to the prison," the sheriff said. The young man was startled to see the sheriff arresting and putting him in prison. Burglary had a severe punishment in a Muslim land. The thief would lose his arm. He began to weep and beg for his release. "I am not a thief," he said. "I am not even a beggar. I have come from Baghdad. I am a stranger in this strange land. I am your guest, hungry and penniless. And this was the first night I came out to beg for food. And I was actually wondering why there were no people outside tonight until you came and caught me." The sheriff listened to him, and judging from his clothes and manners, the sheriff noticed that the man was indeed not from Egypt. He asked, "What has brought you to Egypt?" The young man narrated the story of his dream vision of a hidden treasure in Egypt, that finding this treasure would save his life. The sheriff laughed and said, "You don't seem to be a thief or a beggar, but you are for sure a stranger and a stupid person. You have believed your dream, have come all the way from Baghdad to Egypt. I also have dreams like that, but I am wise enough not to leave my hometown and search for treasure that were only in my dream. In fact, recently I had a dream that there was a huge treasure buried in the house of such and such person in Baghdad. But it was only a dream." As the sheriff mentioned the location of the house and the name of the landlord, the young man realized that it completely matched his own house in Baghdad. But he kept quiet, and he let the sheriff accuse him of lacking common sense and intelligence. At last, the sheriff let him go. The young man said to himself, "I should hurry back to Baghdad. All the time I was sitting on a treasure in my own house, but didn't know it, and I thought I was poor. Am I really stupid? No, I was simply unaware. Then he wondered, why didn't God let me know the real location of the treasure in my dream? Why did the voice in my dream send me to Egypt, so far away from the treasure? He reflected on these questions and said to himself, God indeed wanted me to make this journey in search of the treasure in Egypt. Had I not come to Egypt, I would not have found out the real treasure hidden in my own house. Every step I took forward, every step I took toward Egypt, I was getting farther from Baghdad, where the treasure really was. But I should not misjudge the ways of God. With each step toward Egypt, I was also becoming closer to my own treasure. Indeed, there was a hidden grace in this whole journey. The young man returned to Baghdad, and for sure he found a chest of gold chains buried in his own backyard. But this time he had worked hard to gain this wealth. He had realized it with both his body and his soul. Yes, it was his treasure hidden in his own house in Baghdad, but the journey to Egypt was well worth taking. Looking back, the young man noticed that all along his journey there was safety hidden in danger, grace hidden in hardship, and victory in his fear. He was a true seeker, and his search had come a full circle. At first, he lost the windfall wealth, but eventually gained real wealth because he remained sincere, hopeful, and committed all through his journey. This is the story that Rumi said. Now, one question. Does anyone, can anyone relate this story to any novel or modern literature?
I was going to, oh, yeah.
The Alchemist, Paulo Coelho. He took the story and he expanded and created a modern novel, which is a best-selling, one of the best-selling works in contemporary literature. So why we should read Rumi or how classical poetry can help us? I think The Alchemist is the answer to. Okay, I have two more slides. As Nathan kindly introduced me, I founded Rumi Poetry Club back in 2007 in Salt Lake City. At that time, 2007, it was the 800th anniversary of Rumi's birth. We have had monthly meetings, annual meetings, etc. But we have also published some books related to Rumi. Also a book, Sand and Sky, actually poems from Utah. They are not Rumi's poems, but we collected some original new poems from poets who live in Utah. So these are some of the publications. They are available, you know, on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc., online, etc. So I am working on two new works. One is Through Love, Pain is Healed. This is almost done. It will come out in a couple of months. Another book, Why Rumi Matters. This is an anthology contributed by lots of Rumi scholars, translators, and artists. And several years ago, I requested them to write about their own journey, how they were drawn to Rumi. So this is another book, because you know, books like this take years really, because but I am glad, you know, these two books are also on portfolio for this year. And This is my last slide. This is a picture of Konya, Konya's sky. I took this picture in October 2010, 13 years ago, almost. It was the last night of my stay, the last night of my stay in Konya. And as I was going back to my hotel from Rumi's shrine, I looked at the sky and I wondered, this is amazing. 700, 800 years ago, Rumi also looked at the same sky. You know, this sky, there's only one sky. It connects, centuries, it connects cultures, it connects, lands and peoples. So I thought there was a sense of mystery, when I was looking at the sky, and I wanted to share this with you. And thank you very much for being here, for your patience, and for attending this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasoul Shams. That was a wealth of wisdom and a not so subtle nudge for all of us to go and read Rumi. Not only read Rumi, but take him up and really study him and repeat reading him and really absorb ourselves into his poetry. I've done that the past month or so, and like I was telling you before, I've noticed that in order to really appreciate him, you have to open part of yourself to him and let him through to really understand his mystical side.
Right. You mentioned this even before our session started, that really Rumi touches on the neglected corners of our life.
That's true.
That is so true.
Well, I want to open this. Thank you. I want to open this up for all of you to ask questions. Just type them up through the Q&A. I'll just start with a question and then open it up to everyone else. I've been trying to think of why Rumi has become so popular in not only the United States of America, but also Europe and really the Western world, I think, as a whole. And I think part of it is because as we move away from kind of institutional trust, institutional attachments, institutional orientations, we seek something deeper, maybe something more subtle, maybe something more fine, and something more free, perhaps. Do you know if Rumi intended to write his poetry in a way that would create tension with established institutional religions?
Well, it is very hard to read even a living person's mind, let alone a dead man's mind, right? So it's very hard. But just from the works that he has left, you see, he himself was a Muslim scholar, right? So he was rooted in philosophy and religious teachings of his own tradition. For sure, he didn't want to be involved in petty conflicts. That's for sure. You see, the century he lived, we think that we are living in a very dangerous century. But in the 13th century, you had Mongols invading and massacring people from the east. And then you had crusades, so Rumi and, that part of the world was sandwiched between these two armies. But in none of his poetry, he shows hostility to anyone. I feel he really wanted to offer a basic solution to wars, conflicts, rather than being a part of it. See, it is not easy to do. It's not easy to be calm and then try to create a set of teachings which go beyond, all beyond any side you are in. It doesn't matter. So for sure, he openly didn't want to, oppose any established or emerging or any religion or any culture. I think he was so much rooted in his own experience that he just didn't want to waste his time. And he did appreciate the value of his work. I think he was aware of the significance of his work. And that's why he devoted, almost half of his life to it.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to a question. Some Western readers criticize Coleman Barks for stripping the Islamic character from Rumi's work. What is your position on this?
Well, I think before the session, Nathan was also asking me almost the same question. You see, translation is always difficult. Even if you know the language, still the translation is not easy. And I can say that from my own, little experience, with Rumi and Persian literature. Now, Coleman Barks, for sure, he should take credit for popularizing Rumi. If Coleman Barks had not started, his work and presenting Rumi in the modern American literature and the free verse poetry, I don't think we would be here tonight, to discuss Rumi. So I personally, I think, he has contributed a lot. And he doesn't claim that he knows the Persian language. So he's honest. He takes literal translations, as I said, and then he recreates modern poetry, from Rumi's classical works. As for the relationship between Rumi's poetry and Islam, well, Islam is a religion, right? You can be a poet, a Muslim poet, a non-Muslim poet. So I think Coleman Barks' approach to Rumi, he's taking him as a poet. So he could be a Christian poet. He could be, he could have any religion. In Rumi's own works, if you read even Rumi's poetry in the original language, it's not that all the time he's trying to preach a particular religion. It's not. When you are a poet, you are a poet. For example, in the Divan Shams, which as I said, 3,500 lyric odes, like sonnets, like Shakespearean sonnets, and 2,000 short quatrains. He rarely mentions the word God, rarely. And when he addresses God, or he calls the beloved, or life, or heart, he rarely uses the word God. So if that is Rumi's own approach to divinity, then why should we criticize Coleman Barks, for misrepresenting Rumi? But as I said, I think Coleman Barks' approach to Rumi is not so much, he's not trying to translate the works of a religious scholar. He's trying to translate the work of a poet, a mystical poet, whose message is ageless, is timeless. I think we should read Coleman Barks, in this spirit. There are literal translations of Rumi. I mean, there was no need for Coleman Barks to go and do the same thing, over and over. Of course, sometimes Coleman Barks' translations are not literal, or not accurate, but that is his impression. There are many translations. There are many translators of Rumi, and each translator brings something to the table. And I enjoy reading, personally, I enjoy reading all of them. And at Rumi Poetry Club, we have read translations of Rumi from various, people, Coleman Barks being one of them. So I think it is unfair to expect Coleman Barks to translate Rumi in a religious, voice. Coleman Barks himself is a poet, and he considers Rumi as a poet. So his poetry is more important than, he could be, he could have any religion, really.
Thank you. I'll just ask another question from one of the viewers. The viewer says, while visiting Turkey last year, I was surprised to hear my Turkish guide say that Rumi was not a good person and is not well thought of by many Turks. Do you know if this is true? And if so, what issue they may have with him? I vaguely recall feeling that he may have been referring to Rumi being thought of as a traitor. I'd never heard this before.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know, which friend is asking this question, but he or she should have asked that Turkish guide, not me. I don't know. I'm not making that statement. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I suppose that, various audiences throughout the years could have various interpretations of his historical, value or presence in the country. But I did have another question about Rumi as a kind of universal poet laureate of sorts. This is a paraphrase. I believe he said something like, all religions carry love within it, but love belongs officially to no religion. Can you think of any other poet or writer of that time, or even any other time, that could lay claim to that title as being a universal poet or writer?
well, I'm sure there are many poets, in Persian before Rumi and even after Rumi. In English, there have been universal poets like Walt Whitman, you mentioned, one of them. Universality, love is universal. One of the things that I have learned from Rumi is this. Faith can be individual, can be culturally structured. You have faith in one religion, in one sect, you don't have faith in another religion. And so that is one aspect of, our mind. But love is universal. So when your poetry comes from love, it's based on love, of course, you turn to be a universal poet. But if your poetry is limited to a specific faith, to a specific, some specific aspect of your culture, of course, you will be limited. You cannot be, universal. And I think, even Coleman Barks, he says that Rumi is the greatest planetary poet that he has ever read, which is very, it's an amazing statement for a poet who lived like 700 to 800 years ago. Today we have all this global network, and still it is very hard to find a global poet, who would resonate, with lots of people. So for a poet who lived and died like 7, 8 centuries ago, to be accepted by a modern poet as the greatest planetary poet, I think that tells a lot about Rumi's message and the work, actually.
Let me just ask one last question before we close. Rumi, being the mystical poet that he is famously, I believe, somewhat difficult to grasp, somewhat slippery, fluid, and he uses a lot of metaphors in his poetry, like the sun. He talks a lot about the nature of words, the limitation of words. But there's one metaphor that I really like, and that is water. Can you explain briefly the role that water plays in his worldview, his poetic repertoire?
Well, I think that's a very big question um, to be answered, with one person, short amount of time. All elements of nature, water, fire, soil, sky, you name it, they all have symbolism in Rumi's poetry. And for example, in the case of water, there isn't a fixed symbol. Depending on the context, then we have to understand it. For sure, in some of his poems, he uses water as a symbol of flow, change. And he uses that, for example, even when water remains in one place, it becomes stagnant. For example, even water itself can become stagnant, right? So that flow, I think that's very important. The other thing, our relationship with water, that we become thirsty and then we seek water, we drink water. It is, the source of life, etc. So our relationship with water is also, another, I would say, aspect of his symbolism. Water. But there may be other also meanings to it. For example, when he says, don't seek water, seek thirst, it's a beautiful symbolism, because if we are seeking water, which is limited, it's a material, it's once we drink it, then that's the end of it. But if we seek thirst, then we will always have water. See what I mean? There's no end to that, this treasure. Or when, in fact, in some of his poetry, he said, the reason you are seeking water, the reason you are thirsty, because water is seeking you. I mean, this is totally different from the way we think. See, so there are lots of, I would say, mystical layers that we have to uncover when we are reading his poetry. Again, his symbolism is very strong. In fact, one of the reasons I believe that we need many translators to present Rumi is because of that. Because some translator would understand one symbol better than other, because when we translate, it's not a mechanical. It comes from our own life as well, our own understanding as well. So
thanks. That's beautiful and profound. Gita Raksha asks this, and this will probably be our final question. Can you please briefly speak to the symbolism of flute in Rumi's work? The flute.
A flute, yes. Well, the Persian flute, ney, is very important, not only in Rumi's poetry, but also in Rumi's life, as a very important musical instrument. You see, today, we are bombarded by music, right? I mean, you are sitting on a plane, you can listen to classical, you can listen to pop. It is something that even the kings in the past could not dream, right? So in old days, music meant live music. There was no recording. And live music, you had to do a lot to arrange live music. You see, even today, even if you want to attend a live music, or I mean, lots of things go into an organization, etc., organizing it even. So in those days, and Rumi had these musical sessions almost every week, even for women. On Wednesdays, he had some session for women, which was, I mean, very different, like a taboo, even today in most Islamic countries, let alone, you know, in 800 years ago. So one of the instruments which was very favorite of Rumi was flute. And this flute has huge, deep symbolism. I mean, one can go on like talking about it for hours. But I will only just two things. One is flute is cut from the reed bed, right? I mean, this is the reed flute, right? It's so it is cut from the reed bed, from its origin, from its home. So Rumi says that the reason it is lamenting, it is making this sad cry, is because it has been cut from its reed bed, its origin, and wants to go back. So that is one symbolism. But the other aspect of this flute symbolism in Rumi's poetry is that flute should be empty. You see, if it is filled with mud, you cannot make any music. So in the book of Masnavi, which I mentioned, in fact, the first line he writes is, listen, Beshno inne, listen to this flute. This is very interesting, very important. He doesn't say read my book of poetry or memorize it. No, he said listen to this flute. Now, it means you should also be like a flute to be able to listen. It's not simply you are listening to me or to Rumi because Rumi is empty like a flute, but also to be able to really understand Rumi's poetry, we should be empty. Listen to this flute means that this poetry is really comes from an empty flute, because that is how really art is created, from your emptiness. I think that almost all artists would testify to that. Their best writing, their best painting, their best comes from an empty corner of what they don't know what it is. So Rumi's poetry also came from the empty depth of, you know, his life. And but so that's also another that we should be empty to be able to create and also to understand creation.
Thanks. I think that's very similar to his image of the mirror, that he is a mirror reflection. He's kind of the channel through which God or the universe reflects truth to the listener. And likewise with the flute, you know, it's an instrument through which truth can be carried, or beauty can be carried. It's beautiful. Well, I believe we should conclude our discussion, Rasoul, this has been so wonderful to go deeper into Rumi, to also get a broader picture of the context of who he was and what he can offer to us today. And so you've answered the question that yes, very much someone who lived 750 years ago can enrich us as if he was right before us today. So we hope to do this again. You've been a great friend of Books and Bridges over the years, and we hope to do this again sometime.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Thank you for all efforts, and also thank you, friends who have, attended this gathering, wherever you are. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Goodbye.